Welcome to NarrativeNook audio tales where enchanted stories come to life. If you enjoy our stories, please subscribe, like and share to support our channel. Enjoy listening. Roxanne immediately refuted that. I think you got it wrong. We're mere acquaintances and are not close. Cassandra raised an eyebrow and decided to try her luck. In that case, can we switch our groupings for the play? She asked, harboring hope that Roxanne would say yes and she could partner with Lucian instead. Although she hoped to hook up with Lucian even if she failed, she would still be happy to have a hunk like Lucian as her prince in the play. Roxanne was excited by Cassandra's proposal. However, recalling Jeffrey's words, she had her doubts. Can we still make a switch now? She asked, looking uncertain. Cassandra could tell Roxanne was agreeable, so she nodded her head excitedly and said, so long as we're both agreeable, I don't see why not. All we have to do is inform Ms. Ward about our decision. Roxanne was hopeful and nodded in agreement. Jeffrey could not accommodate her request for a switch earlier as he would have difficulty coordinating the change with other parents. However, since Cassandra initiated the switch and both of them were agreeable, she did not think Jeffrey and Pippa had any reasons to object. Ads by PubFuture. After reaching a consensus with Cassandra, the two ladies went back to their own seats. They planned to inform Pippa of their agreement later. Archie and Benny led Roxanne to their seats, and her jaws dropped when she saw where their seats were. She had no idea the boys were seated next to Estella. That meant she had to take a seat next to Lucian. Mommy, the boys gingerly nudged her when they saw her dazed and rooted to the spot, with no intention of sitting down. Roxanne snapped out of her shock, gave the boys a forced smile, and sat down awkwardly, her body tensed. I see Ms. Jarvis is really popular. Didn't know you're so chummy with the other parents, Lucian sarcastically said. Roxanne frowned slightly, puzzled by his mocking. She turned toward him and saw him looking sternly at Cassandra. Cassandra noticed his gaze was on her and she blushed. Lucian furrowed his brow in disdain and looked away. Roxanne gave him a wry smile and said, if you are referring to that lady, then it is all thanks to you, Mr. Farwell. Lucian's gaze darkened upon hearing her rebuke. He knew she would not bother to explain even if he asked, so he left it as it was. At that moment, Pippa came into the classroom with a parent who arrived late. After settling everyone down, she did a head count and was pleased to see a full attendance. She smiled and said, since everyone is here, let's begin our discussion on the scripts for the plays. Before the discussion could commence, Roxanne hurriedly stood up and said, Ms. Ward, Ms. Clark and I would like to switch groups. Everyone was dumbfounded. They could not understand why she would give up on a terrific partner like Lucian and request to switch. Pippa looked toward Lucian, hoping to get a hint of his opinion on that matter. Lucian was frowning and there was indignation in his eyes. Estella, on the other hand, was anguished. Pippa understood how Lucian felt, and she was put in a difficult position. She turned to Roxanne and tried to change her mind. Ms. Jarvis, the groups had been finalized. Moreover, Archie and Benny got along well with Estella, so. Roxanne was a little swayed, but she hardened her heart and insisted, I've discussed with Ms. Clark, and she's agreeable. Pippa was caught in the middle. She could not find a reason to refuse Roxanne's request, but at the same time she was also wary of Lucian's reaction. When Estella heard that Roxanne wanted to switch to another group for the play, she pouted in distress and looked to her daddy for help. Lucian appeared emotionless, but his mouth was tensely shut. Although he did not say anything, it was obvious he was pissed. Before he made his way to the kindergarten that morning, he told himself he would avoid getting into a disagreement with Roxanne. However, when he saw she was adamant about switching groups with Cassandra, he couldn't help but get furious. Estella suddenly recalled what Lucian had told her the night before. He had told her he would need her help to mend their relationship with Roxanne. She turned her gaze from Lucian and looked toward Roxanne. She was sniffling as she looked piteously at Roxanne, and tears were brimming in her reddened eyes. Her loud sniffling was very conspicuous in the noiseless classroom, and everyone turned to look at her and Roxanne. "I want Archie and Benny," Estella cried out, pouting and heaving as she tried to control her tears. Everyone felt sorry for her and turned to look disapprovingly at Roxanne. "She's so blessed to be grouped with Mr. Farwell. Many of us would fight for that chance, and yet she wanted to switch. What's wrong with her? The kids got along so well with one another, but she insisted on breaking them apart. Can't she spare a thought for the kids?" The other parents started whispering in hushed tones at the unexpected turn of the event. Roxanne was not oblivious to Estella's anguish and the accusations from the other parents. For a moment she nearly decided to take back her word after seeing how sad Estella was. However, she managed to steel herself, look away, and say, "Ms. Ward, if you have no objections, Miss Clark and I will confirm the switch." Mommy." Benny anxiously tugged at her sleeve and pleaded. Initially, the boys had no issues with Roxanne's request for the switch. They reckoned Estella would still be able to see their mom anyway, even if they were in different groups. However, Estella's tears pained them, and they didn't want Roxanne to switch to another group anymore. There was a visible sense of helplessness in Roxanne as she looked at her boys. Estella wailed sorrowfully when she heard Roxanne insisting on the switch. She wanted to go to Roxanne, but Lucian held her back. Pippa was at a loss, caught between the tearful little girl and an adamant Roxanne. "Ms. Jarvis, as you can see, Estella will only do well with your boys," she voiced. Roxanne looked away from Estella and tried to block her cries from her mind. She was keenly aware that Sonia knew about the anniversary celebration. She trembled at the thought of the consequence if Sonia was to find out that she was going to act in a love story with Lucian and Estella. She didn't want Sonia to jeopardize her hard-earned opportunity to work with the Damaris family. Lucian threw a glance in Roxanne's direction. When he realized she was not going to change her mind, a displeased look flashed across his face. He stood up and announced, "I have no issue with the switch since Ms. Jarvis is reluctant to partner with us and insists on that. However, as you can see, Essie will suffer if she cannot be in a group with Archie and Benny. As such, I seek your understanding that we'll have no choice but to withdraw from this year's performance." Emotionlessly, he gave a slight bow in apology and strode out of the classroom with a reluctant Estella. Estella was hyperventilating from the weeping and struggling violently against Lucian. It was a heart-rending sight, and all the parents turned shockingly toward Roxanne, hoping she would step up to salvage the situation. Upon seeing Estella crying her eyes out and Lucian leaving all of a sudden, Roxanne clenched her fists so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. Ms. Jarvis, even Pippa was trying to speak up for Estella. Cassandra quickly got up and said anxiously, "I'm sorry, Ms. Jarvis, but I won't be changing teams anymore. You should go calm Essie down." Her eyes were filled with fear. "All I wanted was a chance to get closer to Lucian, but the arrangement ended up making Estella cry instead. If the Farwell family decides to pursue this matter, I'll definitely be blamed for it." Eventually, Roxanne clenched her teeth and lowered her gaze as she gave in to the pressure. She then walked up to Estella and said, "Stop crying, Essie. I won't change teams anymore, okay?" Estella was crying so hard that she couldn't stop sobbing as she looked up at Roxanne. Roxanne felt her heart ache when she saw Estella's face all covered in snot and tears. As she reached out to help wipe those tears, Estella simply stood there obediently and let her do it. Roxanne was still trying to think of a way to calm Estella down when Lucian's voice rang out from behind her. "You don't have to force yourself if you don't want to do this, Ms. Jarvis. Essie practically never attends class activities like this anyway." Roxanne's feelings of guilt intensified even further after hearing that. "I want Essie to get better. She's finally starting to adapt to being around her classmates, and yet she got so upset because of me. With that in mind, Roxanne caressed Estella's chubby cheeks as she said, I'm sorry, Essie. I take back what I said earlier, okay? Estella nodded and let go of Lucian's hand before throwing herself into Roxanne's embrace. Roxanne felt her heart soften up even further when she held Estella in her arms. And now that the grouping issue has been resolved, let us start discussing the change in the plot, Pippa suggested while breathing a sigh of relief. Everyone agreed and began discussing among themselves. Roxanne stood up and led Estella back toward her seat. Archie and Benny, who were sharing a chair, quickly got up and let Estella have it when they saw her coming. Estella smiled at them with her nose still red as she sat down next to Roxanne. Roxanne had a conflicted feeling in her heart as she watched Pippa, hoping that they could change the plot for Sleeping Beauty. As you may have noticed, we have chosen fairy tales with different themes for this activity. The reason we chose these fairy tales was to help the kids understand the different relationships between people, Pippa explained with a friendly smile. She then glanced at Roxanne and Lucian as she added, romantic relationships are no exception. Roxanne felt her heart sink a little when she heard that. As such, we do not plan on making any changes to the plots of these fairy tales. Is there any parent who objects to this decision? Naturally, no one else had any objections. Roxanne was the only one with an awkward look on her face. If they don't change the plot, then Lucian and I will have to share a kiss at the end of the story. She instinctively glanced at Lucian at the thought of that, only to meet his unfathomable gaze at the same time. The two of them locked eyes for a few seconds before Roxanne averted her gaze and tried to look natural. Just like that, the meeting came to an end after a brief discussion. Pippa stood at the classroom door and waved goodbye at the parents as they left. Roxanne walked up to her with a concerned expression and asked, Ms. Ward, are you sure you don't want to change the plot for Sleeping Beauty? I don't know if it's appropriate for children to witness that final scene. Pippa flashed her a reassuring smile as she replied, Don't worry, Ms. Jarvis. The kids already know about this sort of thing. Besides, you're not really going to kiss in front of them. You'll be positioning yourselves to look like you're kissing. Pippa then looked behind her and asked, I'm sure you'll offer your full cooperation, right, Mr. Farwell? Roxanne tensed up when she heard that. Of course, Lucian replied, his voice sounding like he was whispering right next to her ear. Roxanne lowered her gaze and stepped aside before turning around to look at him. Don't worry, Ms. Jarvis. I'm not the kind of guy who would take advantage of others. Besides, you and I are both parents. There's no way we'd be doing anything inappropriate, Lucian said with a cold look on his face. Relax, Ms. Jarvis. It'll just be a bunch of kids watching the play, Pippa added. Unsure of what to say, Roxanne nodded with a forced smile. Thank you for what you did earlier. No need to thank me. I was just doing my job. Pippa replied casually with a chuckle. Roxanne then had a brief chat with her before leaving. She was about to open her car door when she heard Lucian's voice coming from behind her again. Since you've agreed to work with me, you're not going to bring your personal emotions into the play, right, Ms. Jarvis? Roxanne turned around and nodded calmly. You may rest assured that I'll give the kindergarten my full cooperation, Mr. Farwell. She deliberately emphasized that she was only going along with the play as it was part of the kindergarten's activities. The look in Lucian's eyes turned gloomy when he heard that. That's good to hear. I hope we will be able to work well together. Roxanne felt a little uneasy as she nodded in response. Knowing this guy, he's not going to let me leave so easily. Fortunately, I've already prepared an excuse for myself. To her surprise, Lucian turned around and got into his car without saying a word. Roxanne froze in shock when she saw him start the car and drove off. Miss Jarvis," Cassandra called out to her. Roxanne snapped out of her daze and turned around. "I'm sorry for putting you in a tough spot earlier. I didn't know Mr. Farwell's daughter was so close with your kids," Cassandra said apologetically as she made her way over. Roxanne flashed her a faint smile in response. "It's all right. I agreed to change teams too." Feeling slightly relieved after hearing that, Cassandra asked, "What about Mr. Farwell?" Both of them knew full well what she was implying. Cassandra was the one who suggested the team change, so she was afraid that Lucian would get mad and come after her. As such, she wanted Roxanne to help talk Lucian out of doing so. Roxanne was a little hesitant when she recalled Lucian's cold expression from earlier. "I don't think you have to worry about it. After all, the issue has been resolved and Mr. Farwell isn't that petty of a person." However, Cassandra was still staring at her with a fearful and pleading look in her eyes. Eventually, Roxanne had no choice but to agree to her request. "All right, I promise I'll explain it to him properly." "Thank you very much. Just let me know if you ever need my help with anything, okay? I'll do my best to assist you." Cassandra thanked her profusely while breathing a sigh of relief. Roxanne simply pursed her lips and smiled without saying anything. The two kids were waiting for Roxanne by the time she got home that night. They ran up to her and stared cautiously at her face the moment she came in through the door. "What's the matter?" Roxanne asked with a confused frown. Benny exchanged glances with Archie as he asked in his usual adorable voice, "Are you unhappy, Mommy?" Roxanne felt confused. "What makes you say that?" "You requested for a change in teams earlier at school, but it didn't happen," Benny replied nervously with his lips pursed. Roxanne felt a little stressed when she recalled the stage play that she would be in. "I'm not upset, Benny. Now be a good boy and go get ready for dinner." Still worried about her, the kids waited until she had taken her coat off before sitting down at the dining table. Roxanne saw a mountain of food on her plate when she came back from washing her hands. Archie and Benny were still topping her plate up with food like worker ants feeding their queen. "All right, that's enough. I'm not angry or anything, you two. I really do feel bad for Essie," she said with a chuckle as she ran forward to stop them. Seeing as the kids were still a little unconvinced, Roxanne flashed them a reassuring smile as she put some of the food back. "I can't finish all of this by myself, you know." The kids stopped trying to top her plate up, but still glanced at her worriedly from time to time. Not only did Roxanne fail to change teams, but Pippa had also stated that there would be no change in the plot of the stage play. They knew how much Roxanne wanted to stay away from Lucian, so they were worried that she only agreed to attend the activity because of them. Both Archie and Benny had spent the entire day blaming themselves for what had happened. Oblivious to their thoughts, Roxanne simply continued having dinner with them as usual. After dinner, she was about to take them out for a walk when her phone started ringing. Benny quickly fetched her phone for her, but the look on his face changed when he saw the name on the caller ID. Roxanne felt confused when she saw his sudden change in expression. It wasn't until she saw Lucian's name on the screen that she understood his reaction. "Why would Lucian be calling me at this hour?" After hesitating for a bit, she answered the call and asked, "What is it, Mr. Farwell?" Lucian's deep voice came on the other line. "The stage play takes place next week. When do you plan on rehearsing, Ms. Jarvis?" Roxanne felt her heart sink when she heard him mention the stage play. "Oh right, I forgot we'll have to rehearse it. This means I'll be spending more time with Lucian. This is the first time our kids will be participating in a stage play, Ms. Jarvis. I'm sure you'd want it to be a smooth experience for them, right?" Lucian pressed on. Naturally, Roxanne couldn't bring herself to deny that statement. "When do you wish to start rehearsing, Mr. Farwell?" You're a lot busier than I am, so I'll try my best to accommodate your schedule instead, she said after a brief pause. We can start tomorrow after our kids get off school. We can do it at your place if you don't mind, Lucian replied. It would be late at night by the time they finished rehearsing, so Lucian wanted to save Roxanne the trouble of rushing home with her kids. Since there's no escaping the rehearsal, it doesn't matter where we do it. With that in mind, Roxanne agreed to his arrangement. The next day, Roxanne was so busy working at the research institute that it was already 7 in the evening when she got home. Upon entering the house, she froze in surprise when she saw Lucian standing in the living room. I remember agreeing to rehearse the stage play after the kids got off school, but I didn't think he'd just let himself in without informing me beforehand. Mommy. Archie and Benny called out to her excitedly when they realized she was home. They then gave Estella's hand a gentle tug, prompting her to turn around. Estella had a disappointed expression on her face at first, but her eyes lit up the moment she saw Roxanne. Miss Jarvis!" Estella shouted as she ran over and threw herself at Roxanne before Archie and Benny could. Suppressing her discomfort, Roxanne patted Estella on the head and asked, "When did you come over, Essie?" "She came home together with us," Archie and Benny replied before Estella could. Noticing the frown on Roxanne's face, they continued explaining, "Essie really wanted to see you, so we let her come home with us, but she got a little unhappy because of how late you came home, Mommy." Estella was so happy to see her that she didn't even hear what Archie and Benny were saying. Roxanne's heart softened up when she saw Estella staring at her like that. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting because of work, Essie." Estella shook her head. She was happy as long as she got to see Roxanne. She only got unhappy earlier because she thought Roxanne was avoiding her again. After a few minutes of watching them have fun, Lucian made his way over to them with a blank look on his face. The smile on Roxanne's face was frozen in place when she noticed him approaching. She then met his gaze with a distant look in her eyes. "Mr. Farwell?" Lucian nodded slightly and asked, "Essie came looking for you in a hurry right after school was over, so she hasn't eaten anything yet. Could you please prepare a set of utensils for her?" Naturally, Roxanne wouldn't refuse a request like that. Feeling excited that Roxanne was going to let Estella join them for dinner, Archie and Benny grabbed Estella's hand and ran into the dining room. Roxanne simply shook her head and smiled when she saw their reaction. I've never seen them run toward the dining room so eagerly. They must be really happy, huh? The smile on her face slowly vanished when she recalled that Lucian was still standing next to her. Just like that, the living room fell into an awkward silence. Even after she changed into her slippers, Lucian was still standing there with an emotionless look on his face. Roxanne then glanced at the kids and nodded at him before making her way into the dining room. The kids stopped playing when they saw her coming and just sat there staring at her. Noticing that Archie and Benny had reserved a seat for her next to Estella, Roxanne sat down beside her. She then instinctively glanced at the living room and saw Lucian sitting on the couch all by himself. Because he had his side facing them, she couldn't get a clear view of his facial expression. As if he had detected her gaze, Lucian turned his head and looked in her direction. Roxanne tensed up the moment their gazes met. She then retracted her gaze and tried to act like she was looking at something else in his direction. "Hurry up and dig in. The food is getting cold," Elisa urged them with a smile. Having been snapped out of her daze, Roxanne nodded absent-mindedly and began topping the kids' plates up with food. Estella simply stared at her food and refused to eat it. "What's wrong, Essie? Do you not like the food?" Roxanne asked in confusion. "I don't recall her being a picky eater, though." Estella cautiously glanced at the living room before saying in an adorable voice, "Daddy." Roxanne's expression froze as she knew what Estella was going to say. "Daddy hasn't eaten either." Can he join us? Estella asked with an expectant look in her eyes. Roxanne let out a helpless sigh when she heard that. I figured Lucian probably hadn't eaten when I heard Estella had come over immediately after school. Since he was already here, I thought of inviting him to the table to show him the most basic of hospitality. However, he only asked if I could let Estella join us for dinner, so I couldn't really bring myself to invite him. Besides, he didn't seem like he wanted to join us anyway. Miss Jarvis? Estella tugged at her shirt sleeve. Roxanne let out a silent sigh and patted her on the head as she said, "Sorry, I didn't know. I'll go invite your daddy right now." She then turned toward Lisa and said, "Lisa, bring us another set of utensils." Lisa nodded and went off to fetch the utensils from the kitchen while Roxanne made her way to the living room. Lucian was scrolling through his phone on the couch when she walked up to him. Unsure if he was genuinely unaware of her presence or deliberately waiting for her, Roxanne said, "Essie told me you haven't eaten." Lucian then looked up at her and replied coldly, "Yeah. What the heck is with that attitude of his?" It's obvious that he was deliberately waiting for my invitation. Roxanne thought to herself with a frustrated frown. Since she had already initiated the conversation, she had no choice but to go through with it and asked reluctantly, "If you don't mind, how about joining us for dinner?" Given how cold her tone was, anyone else would have known she was simply being polite and turned her invitation down. Lucian, however, arched an eyebrow at her and said, "I don't mind at all, but I'm not sure if you would, Ms. Jarvis." Roxanne glared at him as she forced the words out of her mouth. "No, I don't." Lucian then put his phone away and got up from the couch. "In that case, I shall graciously accept your invitation." Roxanne nodded and went back to the dining room. As if his plan had worked perfectly, Lucian was smiling gleefully as he walked behind her. While Roxanne was oblivious to his expression, Archie and Benny saw it clearly from the dining table and exchanged surprised glances in response. Who would have thought Daddy was such a cunning guy? While having dinner, Roxanne realized Lisa had arranged for Lucian to be seated right in front of her. As Lucian's gaze would fall upon her from time to time, Roxanne felt extremely uncomfortable throughout the entire meal. After what seemed like forever, they were finally done having dinner. Lisa then cleaned up the table while Roxanne and the others headed over to the living room to rehearse the stage play. Although they had yet to finalize the roles for the play, Lucian and Roxanne became obvious choices for the prince and princess due to the kissing scene. The kids then stared blankly at Roxanne as they were unsure of the roles they should take up. After going through the script, Roxanne gave it some thought before saying hesitantly, "Essie can play the role of the witch." Estella nodded obediently in response. "What about us, Mommy?" Archie and Benny asked in unison while staring at her excitedly. They were curious as they didn't remember finding any roles in Sleeping Beauty that suited the two of them. Roxanne paused briefly before replying with a chuckle, "You two can be the fairies." Archie and Benny went wide-eyed with shock upon hearing that. "What? But we're boys. How will we act as fairies?" Roxanne burst out laughing when she saw their reaction. "All right, let's change the story up a little. You two can act as the dwarves." Archie and Benny breathed sighs of relief as they accepted their roles. Having assigned the roles to the kids, Roxanne stood up and glanced at Lucian, who was standing beside her. He simply stared coldly at her in response. The smile on Roxanne's face slowly faded as she said, "It seems we will have to take up extra roles for this play. Not only will we be playing as the prince and princess, but also as the king and queen." Lucian nodded in agreement without any hesitation, much to Roxanne's relief. "This is the script. Take a look at your lines and try to memorize them as best you can," she said while handing the kids her phone. The kids then huddled together as they read through the script on the phone. Roxanne turned to look at Lucian and said, "We should go through the script as well. Could you search one up on your phone, Mr. Farwell?" Lucian whipped out his phone and searched for a script on the spot. As Roxanne leaned in closer to read the script, the two of them were so near to each other that they could hear each other breathing. Despite Roxanne's best efforts at staying focused on the script, she found herself getting distracted by him a lot. Lucian, on the other hand, was completely calm and focused as he went through the script. Roxanne was blushing so hard that she barely remembered anything even after going through the entire script. She was snapped out of her dazed state when Lucian's voice rang in her ears. "Do you want to read it again?" Roxanne shook her head and stepped away from him as she blurted, "No, I'm good. You can go through it again if you need to, Mr. Farwell." Lucian arched an eyebrow at her in amusement when he saw her reddened face. "Good thing I've already gone through the script a few times before. Also, I don't really have many lines since my character will be sleeping for the most part." Roxanne breathed a sigh of relief at the thought of that. "Oh, we're done, Mommy. Can we start rehearsing now?" the kids asked excitedly after finishing their script. Roxanne nodded absent-mindedly and instinctively glanced at Lucian in response. Having detected her gaze, Lucian put his phone away and nodded at her in response, indicating that he was ready as well. Playing the part of the king, Lucian welcomed Archie and Benny by saying, "Welcome to the party, you adorable elves." Although he had gotten his lines correct, his tone sounded so cold that it didn't match the mood at all. As a result, Archie and Benny found themselves unable to get into character. Roxanne shot Lucian a helpless look and said, "This is a fairy tale meant for children, Mr. Farwell. You'll scare the kids off like that." Unsure of what she meant, Lucian simply frowned at her in confusion. "You need to put more emotion into your lines. We just had a baby, so you should be more happy about it," Roxanne explained. Those words had barely left her mouth when she realized how wrong that sounded. The king and queen are having a celebration for their princess, but you don't sound like you're celebrating at all, she quickly explained with her face all red. Lucian frowned and stared at her in silence. "Try to recall how you felt when Essie was born," Roxanne reminded him patiently. The look in Lucian's eyes turned slightly gloomy as he glanced at Estella. "Her condition was terrible when I got her, so I felt nothing but anger and heartache. There was no excitement whatsoever." With that in mind, he stared at Roxanne and wondered how she felt when she gave birth to Estella back then. Thinking he still didn't understand what she meant, Roxanne tried to give him some more guidance. "How did you talk to your employees at Farwell Group during company parties?" "Just like that," Lucian replied with a straight face. "In that case, I'll say this line instead. You." Roxanne had wanted to tell Lucian to avoid speaking if possible but held herself back when she recalled that he would have lots of lines as the prince. Lucian arched an eyebrow at her in confusion. Roxanne let out an awkward chuckle in response. "And never mind, let's just forget this part for now." Lucian nodded without saying a word. Roxanne then got into character and smiled at Archie and Benny as she continued, "Welcome to the party, you adorable elves." The two kids got into character as well and smiled back at her. "Thank you for the invitation, Your Majesty. Please allow us to give the princess our blessings." Archie and Benny then danced about with their magic wands as they chanted a few magic words. Roxanne was about to thank them when Estella entered the scene as the witch. "You guys sure are bold," she shouted while glaring at them. Roxanne nearly burst out laughing when she saw how cute Estella looked. She then pretended to back away in fear, only to be pulled into Lucian's embrace. "Who are you?" he asked, showing some emotion this time. Estella then replied with her lines according to the script. Meanwhile, Roxanne's mind went blank as she froze up in Lucian's arms. She was so shocked by his sudden hug that she forgot they were rehearsing and instinctively broke free from his grip. Her response was so sudden that Estella stopped reciting her lines halfway through and stared at her in confusion. "What's wrong, Mommy?" Benny asked worriedly. It wasn't until she heard Benny's voice that Roxanne regained her senses and recalled that they were rehearsing. As for Lucian's actions, it was needed by the script. Realizing that fact, the apologetic Roxanne smiled at the children. "I'm sorry for spacing out. Please continue." After exchanging curious glances, the children obediently agreed. Meanwhile, Lucian, who was looking at Roxanne, had an epiphany that brought a grim expression to his face. Feeling guilty to the extent of not daring to look in his direction, Roxanne naturally didn't notice the change in him. As the rehearsal continued, they had to change their roles. Roxanne, playing the princess after she was all grown up, did so with much aplomb. It wasn't until the prince appeared while she was asleep that her frustrations began to build. Taking on the role of the prince, Lucian would either be too aloof or not angry enough when he faced Estella. Naturally, his performance caused Roxanne to worry. "Mr. Farwell, you'll scare the children this way." "Mr. Farwell, you're facing a witch, not Essie. You have to look more fierce." Lucian was speechless. After a few rounds, the tired Estella gave her father a wry look, her face filled with annoyance. Under his daughter's glare, Lucian couldn't resist feeling helpless about it. Despite his desire to act well, he was hampered by his inherently calm temperament, making it difficult for him to express the right emotion. Without saying a word, both father and daughter stood still and glared at each other. Watching the scene, Roxanne couldn't help but feel amused. Despite knowing Lucian for very long, this was the first time she saw him being bad at something. When she saw Estella on the brink of tears, Roxanne stroked her head with a smile. "Essie, why don't you take a break? I'll take over your role in the scene with your daddy." After nodding with a pitiful expression, Estella headed to where the brothers were, her head hanging low. Roxanne subsequently took her place opposite Lucian. When she saw the expression on Lucian's face, Roxanne, too, was exasperated. "Mr. Farwell, you're here to rescue someone, not kill them, so don't look so cold." Furrowing his brows, Lucian took her advice and tried to adjust his expression accordingly. Unfortunately, no matter how hard he tried, it just wouldn't come out right. Sighing softly, Roxanne reached out to press the corner of his lips. "Relax. Don't be so tense." No sooner had she spoken than both of them froze. Roxanne, with an awkward expression, retracted her hand and returned to her spot. As for Lucian, he maintained the smile that Roxanne had drawn on his lips. Despite that, his brows were knitted, making for a really weird sight. When the three children saw Lucian and Roxanne's reactions, all of them were equally confounded. After a moment of deathly silence, Roxanne was the first to regain her composure. Checking the time as if nothing had happened, she smiled at the children. "It's getting late. Since you have school tomorrow, that will be all for today." Given how much intimacy had occurred between them during the entire period, Roxanne was too embarrassed to face Lucian anymore. Fortunately, the children were cooperative and readily agreed with what she said. When she didn't hear Lucian's answer after a while, Roxanne, steeling herself, looked up at him. "Mr. Farwell, let's continue next time." Noticing the panic on her face and recalling the sensation of her touch, Lucian nodded as an unknown emotion flickered through his eyes. All right." Just as he spoke, he went to Estella's side to hold her hand. Nonetheless, Estella gave Roxanne a reluctant look. "Miss Jarvis, are we going to continue tomorrow?" Estella wanted to see her every day. In the end, Roxanne answered in a vague manner that indicated her agreement. Thank you for listening. If you have enjoyed this story, please like and share so others can see it too. Also hit the subscription button and notification bell so you can be notified on our next release. Thank you for your support. God bless you.